There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a house when a dream dies. Not the dramatic crash of broken glass or the slam of a door, nothing so theatrical, just absence. The sound of something that should have arrived but didn't. I remember the afternoon the letter came. October 17th. The maple outside Marcus's window had turned the color of rust, and the light filtering through it painted everything in shades of amber and decay. He'd applied early decision to Whitmore College, his father's alma mater, his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Ashford men had walked those cobblestone paths, had sat in those oak-paneled lecture halls, had formed the connections that would shape their futures in those ivy-covered dormitories. Marcus had done everything right. Valedictorian of his class, captain of the debate team, 4 years of volunteer work at the county literacy program, a published essay in a national journal on environmental policy, letters of recommendation that his counselor said were among the strongest she'd ever written. And still, the envelope was thin. I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, the single page resting in his lap like something dead. He wasn't crying. Marcus never cried, not since his father's funeral when he was 14. He'd learned too young that some griefs are too large for tears. They said I wasn't a fit, he told me, his voice hollow. Not academically, my scores exceeded their median. Not in character, they acknowledged my achievements. Just not a fit for their institutional culture. I sat beside him and read the letter myself. The language was careful, almost surgical in its politeness. They appreciated his application. They recognized his exceptional qualifications. However, the admissions committee had determined that his profile did not align with the particular values and community dynamics Whitmore sought to cultivate in their incoming class. Values, culture, fit. Words that meant everything and nothing. Words designed to reject without explanation, to close a door while pretending it had never been open. "Mom," Marcus said, and for a moment he sounded like the little boy he used to be, the one who believed his mother could fix anything. What did I do wrong? I didn't have an answer, not then, but I would find one. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and I have spent my adult life building things. Not the showy, performative kind of building, not the real estate developments with my name emblazoned across billboards, or the tech startups designed primarily to generate headlines. I build foundations, infrastructure, the invisible architecture that holds communities together. After Richard died, I threw myself into the work with a focus that bordered on obsession. His pharmaceutical company, the one his family had dismissed as a hobby project when he'd started it in our garage, had become a billion-dollar enterprise under my guidance. I'd taken his research on rare, pediatric diseases and transformed it into treatments that had saved thousands of children's lives. The profits from those treatments had funded scholarships, research grants, children's hospitals across 3 continents. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because Richard had believed that medicine shouldn't be a privilege, that healing should be accessible to everyone, regardless of circumstance. I did it because continuing his work was the only way I knew to keep him alive. But the world doesn't care about quiet impact. The world cares about names on buildings and seats at charity galas. So I learned to play that game too, learned to smile at events where people valued my checkbook more than my opinions, learned to make small talk with executives who couldn't remember my name 5 minutes after I introduced myself, learned to navigate a landscape where my worth was measured in commas and zeros. I'd become very good at that game, good enough that most people never suspected I was playing it at all. Whitmore College had been courting me for years. Their development office sent quarterly reports on giving opportunities. Their president had invited me to 3 separate campus events, each time positioning me near potential fellow donors as if proximity might prove contagious. I'd declined politely, explaining that my philanthropic focus remained on medical research and direct community impact. The truth was simpler. I'd never forgiven them for what they'd done to Richard 30 years ago when he was a promising young biochemistry student. He'd been accused of academic dishonesty by a professor whose own research he'd inadvertently challenged. The charges were baseless. Richard had simply arrived at a conclusion that contradicted his mentor's published work. But Whitmore's administration had sided with the professor without investigation. Richard had been expelled 6 weeks before graduation. He'd rebuilt his career from nothing, completed his degree elsewhere, earned his doctorate, started his company. But he'd carried that wound until the day he died. The injustice of it. The way an institution he'd trusted had chosen convenience over truth. When Marcus decided he wanted to apply to Whitmore, I'd held my tongue. The school had changed leadership 3 times since Richard's expulsion. Perhaps, I thought, it had also changed its character. Perhaps my son deserved the chance to write his own story there, separate from his father's pain. I should have known better. Institutions don't change. They just learn to hide their flaws more elegantly. The rejection letter offered no appeal process, but I wasn't interested in appeals. Appeals require believing that the system made an honest mistake. That explanation and evidence might correct an error. This wasn't an error. I began my research the way I always do, quietly, methodically, without announcing my intentions. Whitmore's admissions process had been the subject of several lawsuits over the past decade, all settled confidentially. I hired a legal research firm to compile the details, not to pursue litigation, but to understand the patterns. What I found confirmed what I'd suspected. Institutional fit had become their euphemism for arbitrary exclusion. Students with lower test scores but higher profile connections were admitted regularly. Children of donors, of alumni with board positions, of politicians and celebrities received consideration that their qualifications alone wouldn't have warranted. The system wasn't designed to identify merit. It was designed to perpetuate privilege while maintaining plausible deniability. But the more I dug, the more specific the picture became. Dean Harrison Whitfield, the man who'd overseen admissions for the past 8 years, had a particular philosophy he shared freely at higher education conferences. I watched recordings of his speeches, read his published articles, studied his career trajectory. He spoke eloquently about holistic evaluation, about the importance of building a student body that reflected Whitmore's unique character. He used words like synergy and cultural contribution without ever defining what they meant. What he didn't mention in his speeches was his pattern of rejecting students whose applications threatened his personal preferences or challenged his assumptions. A former admissions officer, now teaching at a state university after being quietly let go, agreed to speak with me off the record. Whitfield has lists, she told me over coffee in a neutral location 3 states away. Official ones that go through committee and unofficial ones that don't. Applications he flags for special consideration, usually children of people he wants to impress. And applications he flags for rejection, regardless of merit. What determines which list? She'd hesitated, stirring her coffee in slow circles. Sometimes it's politics. Students whose parents have publicly criticized the college or supported competing institutions. Sometimes it's personal. I saw him reject a stellar applicant because her mother had been engaged to him 20 years ago and broken it off. She paused. And sometimes it's just petty. He doesn't like certain kinds of success. Students who've achieved too much, too young, who might outshine the legacy, admits he's prioritized. He calls it managing optics, but really, he just doesn't want anyone who might make his preferred students look ordinary by comparison. Can you prove any of this? Not in court. He's too careful. Everything goes through proper channels eventually, with enough bureaucratic cover to look legitimate. But the patterns are there if you know where to look. I thanked her and paid for her coffee. Then I went home and began looking. 6 weeks after Marcus's rejection, I made my first move. It wasn't dramatic. Drama is for people who lack patience. I simply called Whitmore's Office of Development and informed them that I'd reconsidered their previous invitations. I was interested in discussing a significant gift to the university, significant enough that I'd prefer to speak directly with President Davidson rather than a development officer. The callback came within 4 hours. President Davidson was everything his public persona suggested. Polished, professional, effusively welcoming. He invited me to campus for a private tour and lunch at the president's residence. No pressure, he assured me. Just an opportunity to share Whitmore's vision and learn about my philanthropic priorities. I accepted. The campus was beautiful, I'd give them that. October had softened into November, and the trees had shed their leaves to reveal the clean lines of Georgian architecture. Students walked in clusters across the quad, their voices carrying the particular pitch of young ambition. I could see why Richard had loved it here, before that love curdled into betrayal. Davidson walked me through the new Science Center, the renovated library, the performing arts complex that bore the name of a tech billionaire's daughter. He spoke about Whitmore's commitment to innovation, to interdisciplinary learning, to preparing students for an uncertain future. He didn't mention the lawsuits, the settlements, the faculty controversies that had quietly disappeared from news cycles after strategic donations. Over lunch, locally sourced, elegantly plated, served by staff who moved with rehearsed efficiency, he asked about my interests. Medical research remains my primary focus, I said. but I'm increasingly drawn to education. The pipeline matters. If we want young scientists who approach their work with integrity and vision, we have to cultivate those qualities early. Absolutely, Davidson nodded. Whitmore has a long tradition of producing leaders in medicine and research. Some of our most distinguished alumni. I know, I set down my fork. My late husband was one of them, Richard Ashford. Something flickered across Davidson's face. Recognition followed by careful calculation. Richard Ashford, the pharmaceutical researcher. I didn't realize we weren't aware of your connection. He rarely discussed it. The circumstances of his departure were complicated. Davidson nodded slowly, his expression shifting to practice sympathy. I've reviewed some of that history, before my time, of course, but I understand there were difficulties. I want you to know that Whitmore has changed significantly since then. We've reformed our academic integrity processes, added multiple layers of review. I'm not interested in relitigating the past, President Davidson. What's done is done. I picked up my water glass, holding it to the light. I'm interested in the future, in making sure institutions like Whitmore live up to their stated values. Of course, and we would be honored to partner with you in that mission. I smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I'd like to propose a gift of $50 million. To his credit, Davidson barely blinked. Men in his position learned to receive large numbers with equanimity. That's extraordinarily generous, Mrs. Ashford. We would be deeply grateful. There are conditions. Naturally, we're always happy to discuss. The gift would establish the Richard Ashford Chair in Biomedical Ethics and fund a new research center focused on pharmaceutical accessibility. In return, I would expect a seat on the board of trustees and full transparency regarding admissions processes, particularly any reforms implemented under Dean Whitfield's leadership. The temperature in the room shifted. Davidson's smile remained in place, but his eyes had gone watchful. Those are substantial requests. The board position would require approval from existing members, and admissions policies involve complex privacy considerations. I understand. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate, merely the same access any major donor receives. I held his gaze. $50 million is the beginning, President Davidson. If our partnership proves fruitful, I envision considerably more. The Ashford Foundation has resources that could transform Whitmore's research capabilities for generations. He was quiet for a long moment. I could see him calculating the gift itself, the potential for future giving, the prestige of association with the Ashford name, weighing those benefits against the risk of allowing someone like me inside their walls. Greed won, as I knew it would. I think we can work something out, he said finally. The board approved my appointment in February. The vote wasn't unanimous. 3 members had reservations about admitting a trustee with potential personal grievances against the institution. But the majority recognized what my presence represented. Money, yes, but also legitimacy. The Ashford Foundation's reputation for integrity would reflect well on Whitmore, would help smooth over the PR difficulties that kept surfacing despite their best containment efforts. They didn't understand that I wasn't interested in smoothing anything over. I was interested in excavating. My first few months as a trustee, I did nothing unusual. Attended meetings, reviewed reports, asked questions that seemed naive but were carefully designed to reveal inconsistencies. I was patient and polite and unfailingly appreciative of everyone's time. Dean Whitfield in particular seemed to enjoy explaining things to me. He was a small man in expensive suits, with the kind of silver-streaked hair and manicured confidence that certain institutions cultivate. He spoke about admissions the way some people speak about wine, with elaborate vocabulary and implied superiority, as if understanding the process required a refined palate that most people simply lacked. You have to appreciate the art of it, he told me during one committee meeting. Anyone can count test scores and GPAs. The real skill is reading between the lines, understanding which students will thrive in our environment and which will struggle, no matter how impressive they look on paper. How do you make that determination? Experience? Intuition? He smiled. It's not something you can quantify, Mrs. Ashford. That's what makes it an art. I smiled back. It certainly sounds like it. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already begun quantifying it. Every admissions decision for the past 8 years, cross-referenced with applicant data I'd obtained through various channels, some official, some creative. The patterns were exactly as my source had described. Legacy admits with mediocre qualifications, accepted at 3 times the rate of non-legacy applicants with superior credentials. rejections that clustered around specific characteristics. Students whose parents had publicly criticized Whitmore, students whose achievements might overshadow the dean's preferred candidates, students who'd applied from schools or programs that Whitfield had personal grievances against. And there, buried in the data like a splinter under skin, was Marcus. His application had been flagged before it ever reached committee review. Not because of anything in his file, his qualifications were impeccable, but because of a notation in Whitfield's private system. Ashford connection, proceed with caution. They'd known who he was, known who his father was, and they'd rejected him not despite his qualifications, but because of them. Because admitting the son of Richard Ashford, the student they'd wrongly expelled, the researcher who'd gone on to prove his genius without them, would have been an admission of their own failure. They'd punished my son for his father's success. Spring came to Whitmore in waves of cherry blossoms and undergraduate anxiety. Final season transformed the library into a pressure cooker of desperation and caffeine. I walked the campus occasionally, always with a legitimate reason, a meeting, a tour, a donor event, but really just watching, learning. Marcus had enrolled at Stanford. Not his first choice, but hardly a consolation prize. He'd found his footing there, had already published another paper, had begun research with a professor whose work on sustainable pharmaceuticals aligned perfectly with his interests. He was thriving, but I hadn't forgotten. Some wounds heal clean, and others leave scars that ache when the weather changes. My son would be fine, better than fine, but that didn't erase what had been done to him. What Whitmore had tried to take from him simply because his existence was inconvenient to men who valued their own comfort over justice. In April, President Davidson announced his retirement. Health reasons, the press release claimed, though campus gossip suggested other factors: donor fatigue, board conflicts, a series of administrative failures that had accumulated beyond easy repair. The search for his replacement would begin immediately. I volunteered to serve on the search committee. No one objected. Why would they? I was a major donor, a respected trustee, someone whose judgment seemed sound and whose questions were always framed as genuine curiosity rather than challenge. They welcomed my involvement. They didn't understand that the search itself was irrelevant to me. What mattered was the access to files, to conversations, to the inner workings of an institution that had operated for too long without genuine accountability. Dean Whitfield, I learned, was considered a candidate, not the front-runner. His reputation was too narrow, too focused on admissions rather than academic leadership, but a possibility. He'd made it clear to anyone who would listen that he expected the promotion, that his years of service entitled him to consideration. The man who had rejected my son believed he deserved to run the institution that had enabled his petty tyrannies. I almost admired the audacity. The key to revelation is timing. Act too early and you appear desperate, vengeful, easy to dismiss. Act too late and the moment has passed, the impact diminished by distance. But find the precise instant when attention is focused, and truth will land like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward until they touch every shore. Whitmore's presidential search culminated in a series of campus forums where finalists would present their visions and answer questions from students, faculty, and trustees. The events were heavily publicized, attended by journalists and alumni, live-streamed to thousands who couldn't be present in person. Whitfield wasn't among the finalists. His candidacy had quietly dissolved when the search committee found his vision insufficiently broad. But he attended every forum, seated in the front row, his presence a reminder of his influence. He asked questions designed to make the candidates uncomfortable, to showcase his own expertise, to position himself as a kingmaker even if he couldn't be king. I attended every forum too, but I sat in the back, watching, waiting. The final forum fell on a Thursday evening in late May. The auditorium was full, the atmosphere charged with institutional anxiety. 3 candidates had presented, each offering versions of the future that sounded remarkably similar: innovation, inclusion, excellence. Words that meant whatever the listener wanted them to mean. The question period was winding down when I raised my hand. The moderator, a senior faculty member who'd smiled at me across countless committee tables, nodded in my direction. "Mrs. Ashford, please." I stood, my notes folded in my pocket, though I wouldn't need them. I knew every word by heart. "Thank you. I have a question for the candidates, but I'd like to provide some context first." I paused, letting the room settle. As many of you know, I joined this board after making a significant gift in my late husband's memory. Richard Ashford was a Whitmore student, until he wasn't. He was expelled in his senior year over academic integrity charges that were later proven baseless. Charges brought by a professor whose research he'd unintentionally contradicted. The room had gone very quiet. I could see Whitfield in the front row, his expression carefully neutral. What many of you don't know is that my son Marcus applied to Whitmore last year. His qualifications exceeded every metric this institution claims to value. He was rejected. The letter cited fit, a word I've since learned is admissions shorthand for decisions that can't be justified on merit. Mrs. Ashford, the moderator's voice was uncertain. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate. I've spent the past year understanding how admissions decisions are actually made here, I continued. My voice steady. I've reviewed data, interviewed former staff, analyzed patterns. What I've found is an institution that says it values excellence while systematically privileging connections over capability, that speaks of diversity while maintaining invisible hierarchies, that rejects qualified applicants because their success might embarrass those who've built careers on mediocrity. I turned to face Whitfield directly. He'd gone pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Dean Whitfield maintains unofficial lists, applications he flags for special treatment based not on merit but on personal preference and institutional politics. My son's application was flagged the moment it arrived, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because his father's name reminded this institution of its own failures. The murmuring in the audience was building. Whitfield stood, his voice tight with controlled anger. These are serious allegations, Mrs. Ashford. I would hope a trustee of this institution would bring such concerns through appropriate channels rather than— I did bring them through appropriate channels. 18 months ago, when I first joined the board, I raised questions about admissions transparency. I was told the processes were sound, that my concerns were based on incomplete understanding. I was patronized, Dean Whitfield, by people who assumed I would accept their explanations because I didn't know how to ask the right questions. I pulled a folder from my bag. This contains 8 years of admissions data, cross-referenced with internal communications obtained through public records requests and confidential sources. It documents patterns of preferential treatment, discriminatory rejection, and systematic violation of Whitmore's stated policies. I've provided copies to the Board of Trustees, to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and to 3 journalists who have been investigating higher education admissions for years. The auditorium erupted. The aftermath was less dramatic than the moment itself. These things always are. Institutions don't collapse, they adjust. They form committees and issue statements and conduct internal reviews that find problems were isolated and have already been addressed. They survive because they're designed to survive. Because the people who run them are experts at absorbing damage and redirecting blame. Whitfield resigned within a week. The official explanation cited a desire to pursue other opportunities, but the campus newsletter reported that his departure was by mutual agreement following a comprehensive review. His name was quietly removed from consideration for any leadership positions. Within 2 years, he was teaching at a mid-tier college in another state. His career a cautionary tale that administrators would study but never publicly acknowledge. The admissions reforms I'd advocated were implemented gradually, not because the board suddenly valued transparency, but because the external pressure made maintaining the status quo impossible. New oversight processes, clearer criteria, regular audits, small changes that wouldn't transform the institution overnight but might over time make it harder for the next Harrison Whitfield to exercise unchecked power. My $50 million went exactly where I'd intended, to the Richard Ashford Chair in Biomedical Ethics and the research center bearing his name. Every year, Whitmore students would study pharmaceutical accessibility in buildings funded by the man they'd once expelled. Every year, they would learn that integrity matters, that truth has value, that institutions serve people rather than the reverse. It wasn't complete justice. Complete justice would require undoing what had been done, returning to Marcus the months of self-doubt, to Richard the years of rebuilding, to all the students whose applications had been flagged and rejected for reasons they would never understand. That kind of undoing isn't possible. Time moves in one direction, and the past remains fixed no matter how fiercely we wish otherwise. But partial justice has its own value. The exposure of rot, even if the institution survives. The removal of those who wielded power carelessly. The creation of barriers, however imperfect, against future abuse. And there was something else, something I hadn't anticipated when I began this campaign. A kind of peace I'd been carrying since Richard's death, since Marcus's rejection, since every moment I'd watched powerful people behave as if consequences were for other people. I'd spent years building things, companies, foundations, programs that would outlast me. But I'd never confronted the thing that had been built against my family, the casual cruelty of an institution that saw us as problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. Now I had. Not with rage, not with destruction, but with the only weapons that endure: patience, precision, and truth. Marcus called me on a Sunday evening, 6 months after the forum. He was finishing his first year at Stanford, his voice carrying the particular energy of someone discovering their place in the world. "I saw the article," he said. "The Chronicle one, about Whitmore's admissions reforms. Did you read it?" Every word, he paused. They mentioned Dad, not by name, but they referenced historical cases of wrongful expulsion that informed the Foundation's philanthropic focus. I knew what they meant. I was sitting in my office at home, the windows open to catch the evening breeze. The garden was in full bloom, roses Richard had planted years ago, still flowering because I'd never had the heart to replace them. "How do you feel about it?" "Complicated." Another pause. "I'm glad you did it, Mom. Not because of me. I'm fine. Stanford's great. None of this was really about me in the end. But because of Dad. Because they needed to know they couldn't just erase what they did to him. Pretend it didn't happen. They tried." I looked at the photograph on my desk. Richard at 30, holding baby Marcus, both of them squinting into summer light. They spent 30 years trying to pretend it didn't matter, but some things don't stay buried just because you want them to. "The thing I keep thinking about," Marcus said slowly, "is that it wasn't really revenge, was it? You didn't destroy anyone. Whitfield's still alive, still working. The school's still there, still admitting students. Nothing was demolished." "No." "So what was it?" I considered the question. Outside my window, a cardinal had landed on the fence, its red feathers vivid against the deepening blue of evening. "Accountability," I said finally. "Not punishment, consequences. There's a difference. Punishment is about making someone suffer for what they did. Consequences are about making sure what they did is recognized, acknowledged, addressed. Whitfield lost his position because he'd abused it, not because I wanted him to suffer. Whitmore changed its policies because the old ones had failed, not because I wanted to humiliate them. But you must have been angry when you found out about my application, about the flag on my file. You must have wanted to burn the whole thing down." Of course I was angry. I'm still angry some days. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. But anger is energy, Marcus. You can use it to destroy, or you can use it to build. Destruction is faster. Building takes longer, but building is what lasts. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think Dad would be proud of you. I hope so. I know so." His voice was certain in a way that reminded me of Richard, that same quiet confidence, that same refusal to qualify conviction with doubt. "He always said that you were the strong one, that he had the ideas, but you were the one who knew how to make them real." I didn't cry. I'd learned that some emotions are too deep for tears. That feeling doesn't require performance. But I held the phone a little tighter and let myself remember Richard's voice saying something similar, years ago, in our tiny first apartment when the company was just a dream, and Marcus was a possibility we hadn't yet considered. "I miss him," I said. "Me too." We talked for another half hour, about his classes, his research, a girl he'd met in his biochemistry lab who seemed to understand his particular obsessions. Small talk, comfortable and unremarkable. The kind of conversation that happens between people who don't need to prove anything to each other. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness and watched the stars emerge, one by one, above the garden. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from completing a task you've set yourself. Not triumph. Triumph implies defeating someone, and I hadn't defeated anyone. Whitfield had defeated himself. I'd simply ensured his defeat was visible. Whitmore hadn't been conquered. It had been corrected, slightly, temporarily, in ways that would require constant vigilance to maintain. What I felt was closer to resolution, the closing of a chapter that had stayed open too long, its unfinished pages rustling in every quiet moment. I'd done what I could. I'd spoken truth in a room designed for polite deflection. I'd created structures that would make future injustice slightly harder, future accountability slightly more likely. I'd honored my husband's memory, not by destroying the institution that had wronged him, but by transforming his wound into something generative. Scholarships, research, reforms that would benefit students who would never know his name. And I'd shown my son that power doesn't require cruelty, that strength can be quiet, that the most enduring victories are the ones that build, rather than break. Some nights, I still think about Harrison Whitfield. Not with hatred. Hatred requires too much energy, and I have better uses for mine, but with a kind of cold curiosity. Does he understand now what happened to him? Does he recognize that his downfall wasn't orchestrated by a vengeful outsider, but by his own accumulated choices? Each small abuse of power adding to a weight that eventually became unsupportable? Probably not. People like Whitfield rarely achieve that kind of self-awareness. They convince themselves that they were victims of politics, of jealousy, of a system that failed to appreciate their contributions. They rewrite their histories until the story makes sense, until they're heroes, rather than cautionary tales. That's their burden to carry, not mine. Mine is simpler, to continue building. To find the next injustice that requires attention, the next institution that could be improved, the next young person whose potential is being squandered by systems designed for someone else's benefit. There's no shortage of work, and I've never been someone who does well with idle time. Richard used to say that the best revenge is living well, but I've come to think he was only half right. The best revenge is living well and using that well-lived life to make the living well of others more possible, to transform private pain into public good, to take what was done to you and do better with it than those who did it ever imagined. That's the real victory, not destruction, not triumph, just the quiet, persistent work of making the world slightly more just than you found it. Last week, I received a letter from a young woman named Sarah Chen. She was a first-generation college student from a rural high school, admitted to Whitmore under the new admissions protocols implemented after the reforms. She'd read about the Richard Ashford Center for Pharmaceutical Accessibility and wanted me to know that her mother had been saved by one of the treatments Richard developed, a medication for a rare childhood cancer that would have been untreatable 20 years ago. I'm studying biochemistry, she wrote, because of what your husband's work meant to my family, and I'm at Whitmore because someone made sure that students like me would have a fair chance. I don't know if you were involved in either of those things, but I wanted to thank you anyway. Sometimes it helps to know that the people who came before you left things a little better than they found them. I keep the letter in my desk drawer, next to the photograph of Richard and Marcus. Some mornings, I read it again, not because I need the reminder, but because it's good to remember that the ripples keep spreading long after the stone has sunk. The work continues. The world keeps breaking, and there's always more to rebuild. But occasionally, in the quiet moments between tasks, I allow myself to feel something like hope. Not the naive hope of youth, which believes that things will get better simply because they should. The harder hope of experience, which knows that better requires effort, requires vigilance, requires people willing to do the work even when no one is watching. I am willing. I have always been willing. And I will continue to be willing for as long as I have breath and resources and the stubborn conviction that justice, even imperfect justice, is worth pursuing. Not for revenge, for reclamation, for Richard, for Marcus, for Sarah Chen and all the students who will come after her, for everyone who was ever told they weren't a fit for spaces they had every right to occupy. We are all a fit for wherever our talents can flourish. The institutions that fail to recognize this aren't protecting their culture. They're limiting their future. I made sure Whitmore understood that, and they will keep understanding it for generations to come. The garden needs tending. The roses are blooming wild this year, their growth untamed by Richard's careful pruning. I should hire someone to manage them properly, but I keep putting it off. There's something comforting about their chaos, their insistence on growing despite the absence of the hands that planted them. Tonight, I'll walk through the rows he laid out 30 years ago, and remember the man who believed that beautiful things were worth cultivating even when the world seemed determined to destroy them. I'll think about Marcus, flourishing on the other side of the country, building his own future from the foundation we gave him. I'll think about the students at Whitmore who will never know that their admission process was reformed because a mother refused to accept injustice quietly. And I'll think about what comes next. There's always something next. Another institution that needs accountability. Another system that's calcified around privilege. Another young person whose potential is being squandered by people who can't see past their own comfort. I'm not tired yet. I'm not finished. I'm just getting started. The silence in the garden is peaceful tonight. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion. The silence of a story that has found its ending, even if the larger narrative continues. Some things take years to resolve. Some wounds heal slowly, leaving scars that serve as reminders rather than burdens. Some justice arrives so quietly that most people never notice it happened. But it happened. That's what matters. The cardinal is back on the fence, its song cutting through the evening stillness. I stand at my window and listen, and I let myself feel, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter and more sustaining. Peace. The peace of someone who saw wrong and addressed it. The peace of someone who built instead of destroyed. The peace of someone who remembered that power, real power, isn't about making others small. It's about making sure they can't make you small either. Whitmore tried to erase my family. Now my family's name is carved into their buildings, their scholarships, their institutional history. Not as a wound, as a gift. That's the thing about revenge, if you want to call it that. Done right, it doesn't diminish anyone. It elevates everyone. Even, eventually, the people who wronged you. They just don't realize it yet. They will. They always do. They always do. They always do. They always do.